Welcome to the What Good Looks Like podcast, where we shine the spotlight on organizations and leaders who are truly living out what it means to champion the message and the work of purpose in the marketplace today. I'm your host, Davin Salvagno.
Because as soon as you share, I believe very firmly that your eyes will be open to the fact that you are not only enough, you're not alone. The suffering that you're going through in silence, because when you scroll Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook, everyone puts their best face forward. But when you open up and share the struggle that you're going through, others will do the same. And I can almost assure you that they're going through something very similar.
Welcome back to the What Good Looks Like podcast. Today, I'm here with my friend, Eric Brooker. Eric is the founder and CEO of Counsel Culture. He's also host of the Counsel Culture podcast and author of the upcoming book, You Are Enough. I am telling you, you are in for a treat today. Eric, I am so excited. We've had some great conversations over the last couple of months together. Thank you so much for being with us today.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks so much, Davin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for those of you who are tuning in and listening today, if you don't know who Eric is, he is a phenomenal connector of people, but he is also just a trailblazer in the culture space and connected. We have so many mutual friends and people that we've talked to on both of our podcasts, but I want to give you the opportunity to share a little bit about who you are, your background, how you got into this work, and what you're doing with our listeners today.
Yeah, so on a personal front, my wife and I have 7 kids. We live in St. Paul, Minnesota. Today, as we record, is one of the first real cold days of the winter, although I look at the forecast and recognize that we've got about 50 or 60 degrees yet to drop before the real depth of winter hits. But I started a podcast 2 years ago, again, called Counsel Culture, and it really was on the premise of I had had a miserable job at some point earlier in my career, bad leaders, bad culture. And I think we've all experienced that type of environment, although for me, it was very different. When I finally left that business, I realized that I had something to learn. It was easy for me earlier in my career to say, well, they were bad leaders and they had a bad culture and I won't do that again. And ultimately, this was really my journey to realizing that whatever happened, it fell on me, and it was incumbent upon me to not let that happen again. And so I started reading books. And as I started reading books, I went down the path of recognizing that I had questions for authors. I'd read a book. It was a phenomenal book. All of them were really, really good books, but I wanted to know more. And frankly, my buddy Tanner Brock invited me on his podcast. And I said, well, Tanner, what are we going to talk about? He goes, well, what are you passionate about? Your thing is culture, right? So I went on his podcast. We talked about culture and leadership for about an hour. And I thought, this is where I get my questions answered. I'm going to start my own podcast, and we're going to have experts on culture and leadership come on the show, and we're going to learn from them. And initially, if I'm real candid, it was all about what I could learn from these conversations. But to my surprise, I joke that more than my mom and more than my wife listened to the show. We rank really well globally, but the success for me is that I've been able to have these guests on and share their knowledge, their wisdom, and their insight with my audience. And we've been able to learn and grow together.
That is fantastic. And I love, we always talk about the founding purpose of how things start, whether it's companies or in your case, purpose and your podcast and your book and all these different things. And so many times we tend to start things because we think it's a great idea. We think there's a great concept. We think, hey, this is really good. People need this. And there's nothing wrong with that. But for you, this is very interesting. This is the first time I've heard someone say, well, I started a podcast because I wanted to learn. I genuinely wanted to interview these authors because I wanted to learn more. I had questions that I needed answers to, and this was the best way to get them. And so you created something, and yes, you're the host of this podcast, but you also were the number one audience, if you think about it, because you brought these guests on to speak to you directly and then just invited other listeners along for the ride.
Well, and the fun part about it, you're absolutely right. The fun part about it is we've had the founder of Reebok, the CEO of Chipotle, Ken Blanchard. I mean, we've had really big names. And what it really boils down to is these are not people, yourself included, that I would have otherwise met if it weren't for the podcast. So my network of really intelligent people that have a lot to offer, not just me, but my audience, has expanded exponentially because I started the podcast.
That's fantastic. Fabulous. And it's not only giving you answers to questions that you've had, it's connected you to incredible people, but it's also giving you so many different insights that now you've shared with a world that needs to hear it. You had mentioned that you kind of went on this journey because you were in a situation that was not ideal, it was not healthy, and it bothered you, and you wanted to do something about it. And we talk about this all the time, that when you look at really great examples of what good looks like, whether it's leaders or organizations or companies that are truly championing the message and the work of purpose, they found something that didn't sit well with them, or they found a
Yeah.
need in society, or they found something that needs to be challenged or addressed, and you've done that. So talk to me about not just the podcast, but how that's now evolved into this greater work that you have going on through your company council culture, through this new book that you have coming out called You Are Enough. Talk to me about how this podcast has now moved into kind of this movement of your work.
Yeah. So when I started the podcast, and even today, I've got a full-time job. I'm in charge of mergers and acquisitions for a tech company. I love what I do, but I'm not passionate. I'm not nearly as passionate about that. I love what I do. I've been in the industry for 20 plus years, but there's something uniquely different about this work, about council culture, about the book, which we'll talk about here in a second, is that we're having conversations that need to happen that in many respects aren't happening. So we have just rolled out a speaking course where I can come and I can speak to audiences, to companies, and it's not so much about leadership and culture. It starts with self leadership. So I'm going to backtrack just a little. You mentioned the book. Today is actually, and I scheduled it today, our conversation intentionally, thinking it would be a really good day to have this conversation. Today is my oldest. As I mentioned, my wife and I have 7 kids. Today's my oldest daughter's 22nd birthday. Unfortunately, we've not spoken to her in 5.5 years. I won't get into the details. Some of the details will be in the book. But I went down this journey for the first 4 to 4.5 years of hiding that from the world. I'd meet someone new, Davin, we'd have conversations, maybe over a drink, maybe over a cup of coffee. You'd say, what do you do for work? How old are your kids? And then oftentimes we have a tendency in society to glob onto that oldest one. Really, she's 21. Where does she go to college? What is she studying? What is she doing? And I didn't know any of that
Mm.
because we stopped talking 5.5 years ago. But in an effort to save face and not be vulnerable, Davin, I would tell you she went to Skidmore College in upstate New York. She was studying liberal arts because Skidmore is a liberal arts college. And I gave you what I thought I knew to be true in an effort to not have you judge me. And about a year ago, I started sharing with the world that we've not spoken in now 5.5 years. And what I've realized is that we're all suffering, that someone, if not everyone listening to this podcast, has an estranged relationship with a family member or a dear friend that they're hiding from the world because it's just easier not to talk about. But as I went on that journey of kind of coming to terms with the fact that as a parent, I am enough, I realized that there were all of these moments as a child and as a young adult, as an employee, that I felt like I wasn't enough, right? It was when my parents got divorced, or when I first got divorced, or when I got fired from my first job, or I got laid off. These moments in time as again, children or young adults, where we go sort of hang our head in shame and feel internally that we're not enough. But this journey I went on, my wife and I went on with our oldest daughter, of recognizing and really coming to terms with the fact that we are enough, has really led to, again, a whole keynote speaking engagement. We're building courses, and people want to hear this because it starts with self-leadership, because you have an incredible audience, Davin, of business leaders across the globe that are struggling to lead. And it's because they don't feel like they have the tools. It's not another book. It's not another course. It's not another keynote speech. I believe that we cannot lead others until we first lead ourselves. And until I came to terms with this fact that I was enough and my wife is enough and our other 6 kids are enough, that I really led myself to realizing that I'm now in a good spot. I'm in a good spot emotionally, but that also puts me in a good spot to be a great leader to others.
Mm, mm. That is so good and such an important message that people need to hear. And I know you and I talked about your family and that you have not been in communication with your eldest in 5 years. And you shared very openly and vulnerably. And you're right. Everyone is dealing with something that they're holding back, that they're not sharing, that because of that, they're not able to lead themselves effectively, or they don't think that they're enough. And you mentioned Ken Blanchard, and we both know him well, and he's written 62 books on leadership in 82 years, and in every single one of them, he emphasizes the importance of self-leadership. And so this isn't something new, but it's something that's not taught. It's something that we're not told about. How do we lead ourselves so that first we can understand that we are enough, that we are valued, that our purpose matters. And then once we understand what that is, we can then give that to the world. We can then share that with others. We can't give to others what we don't have.
Correct.
And for you to have to let's if you don't mind, let's unpack this a little bit, and you can go as deep as you want on this, because I don't want to skip by this moment. This is a big deal. How do you
Yeah.
process that? How do you've got obviously all of your other kids, you have your wife, you have this family dynamic, and you have this person that's missing from it. How do you come to this place of that? Because there's some people that are listening to this that are probably saying, oh, that's great. So you just need to say I'm enough, you're enough, and you can move on. But it's not that easy. And I'm sure your book is going to unpack that a little bit. But how has these last 5 years, how have you unpacked that? What has the family dynamic been like? How have you overcome this challenge?
So actually, I just talked to a mother who lost her daughter to suicide, and I asked her if I could sit with her for a cup of coffee. She's someone our kids went to school together last year, and she brought up, and I knew she did it very intentionally, but that first year was a year of firsts. It was the first Christmas. It was the first Thanksgiving. It was the first everything. It was my first birthday where I didn't have my daughter, where it was her first birthday. And that year of firsts was really debilitating until I got to the second year. And then I realized that this is just a year of seconds, that this is just as painful as the year of firsts. But everything really opened. The floodgates opened for me when I realized that I wasn't alone. Again, you've got listeners who are going through a divorce. You've got listeners who've lost their job and can't pay their mortgage. You've got listeners who are alcoholics. I know that because this world is full of them. And all of that is okay. But it only becomes okay when you ask for help. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that my wife, my 6 kids, and I, we've not been to therapy. I'm not saying that that is a good idea or a bad idea. Could we use it? Probably. It's just not something that we have leveraged as our tool to overcome. For some, I think that's a very important tool. But being able to come out of your shell a little bit and share with your intimate audience of people, you've got a group of guys that you hang out with, or if you're a woman, you've got, my wife calls it book club. I jokingly call it wine club. You've got a group of people where you can share intimately those things that you're going through. Again, I'm not suggesting in your one-on-one with your employee this afternoon, you tell them that you're an alcoholic. I'm also not suggesting that you don't, because alcoholism is one of those things that I think sharing with the world is a good thing because there's a level of accountability. But being able to share with people what you're going through, for me, again, a estranged relationship. For you, it might be something different. Because as soon as you share, I believe very firmly that your eyes will be open to the fact that you are not only enough, you're not alone. The suffering that you're going through in silence, because when you scroll Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook, everyone puts their best face forward.
Mm.
But when you open up and share the struggle that you're going through, others will do the same. And I can almost assure you that they're going through something very similar. I'll give an example. My wife, I came home from work. This is probably 6 months ago. Got a 16-year-old and a 6-year-old, among many other children in the house. And my wife said, our little guy, 6, said, I don't want my older brother to go to college. Now, she's been gone. Our oldest has been gone 5.5 years. This is our 6-year-old who doesn't remember his sister. I don't want our older brother, my older brother, to go to college. Well, why wouldn't you want your older brother to go to college? Because when you go to college, you don't ever see your family again. That's his perception.
Wow.
That's his perception at 6. And so thankfully, he was in a position to open up and share that emotion. But until he shared that, we couldn't talk through it. So I believe opening up and being vulnerable to others is the first step in all of us being great leaders. Again, because we're all suffering. My first job, my first realization that I was not a great leader, I had to fire someone. It was the again, if you've ever had to fire anybody, it's a really miserable day. They could suck at their job and it's still a really hard thing to do. And my boss just looked at me and goes, you've done this before, right? Yeah, I've done it before. Of course I've done it before. Because I didn't want to be vulnerable and just share with him that at 30 something, I had never terminated anybody. So this idea of just being vulnerable, it feels like a weakness, but being vulnerable really puts you in a better position to lead others well.
That's so powerful. There's such a freedom in vulnerability that, we end up really binding ourselves because we feel like we can't share the most honest thing that we're struggling, right? And we live in a world, to your point, where it's just, it all looks good out in the public. I can't tell you in the last couple of weeks, actually. I mean, I'll be very transparent, Eric. I'm coming into this podcast exhausted.
Yeah.
It's been just a very busy season with, we ran really hard towards getting the summit done at Notre Dame. And then we ran really hard towards turning that into a movie and then getting that launched. And then I went on an 8-day trip out west to San Diego and Salt Lake City and Denver. And I walked into my house on Thursday night, and my wife had an exhausting week, absolutely exhausting week. She held down the fort. She's amazing. I'm so grateful that she does what she does so that I get to do what I get to do. And it's not always sunshine and rainbows, right? She had to handle, volleyball tournaments and soccer games and after school activities and with our 12 and 8-year-old and just a lot while, I'm gone at conferences for 8 days. And I walk into the door and she's at volleyball with my daughter. My mother-in-law's at the kitchen table doing homework with my son. My son is fighting with my mother-in-law over the homework. And I literally just got off a flight from out west, had to get on a shuttle, get to my car, drive an hour, get home. I walk in the door and drop my bag and jump into the kitchen table full throttle into, homework dad with my mother-in-law. And I'm just like on fumes, right? But on social media, people are sitting there going, oh my gosh, your 8 days look great. Everything was bad. Oh, right. And a friend of mine sent me a text message and said, hey, your trip looked amazing. How are you really doing?
Yep.
And it was so freeing to be able to share how I was really doing. There's a freedom when people can ask, how are you really doing? Or, hey, you've done this before, right? And for you to be able to give your honest answer and not the answer that you think people want to hear, there's a freedom in vulnerability.
It's interesting. I had a guest on my show a couple of weeks ago, and he said there's 2 really magical words in the English language. And he said they are fantastic and imagine. We're going to focus for today's conversation on fantastic. I don't disagree with him, but in the vein of fantastic, it was like, Davin, how are you doing today? And he said the perfect answer is fantastic, because the alternative is like, I'm good. How are you? Well, you're going to say you're good, and then we're going to move about our day. But I think equal to fantastic is, hey, Davin, I've had a really tough start to the day. And again, just that little bit of vulnerability really goes. You actually told me that before we hit record. So I know sort of your frame of mind going in. But I think leveling the playing field, I had a guest on that said, hey, man, I'm sorry I'm late. I am I am absolutely losing to COVID right now. This was about a year and a half ago. And I said, do you need to reschedule? Because no, I know the material really well. I'm just not going to remember the conversation. I'm not going to tell you who it was because it's irrelevant. But I was able to sort of coax him along the conversation because he wanted to fulfill the obligation. Super grateful for that. But I knew where he was. I knew where he was in the day, and that leveled the playing field.
Mm, mm. How do we help more people do that? It's very interesting because if for those who listen to me the first like 5 minutes of this podcast, they're probably like, oh, this is all going to be about like culture at work. And we've like gone in a completely different direction that we needed to. And maybe this is, in your book, You Are Enough, but how do we help people find the freedom to be vulnerable, to be honest, to share what is going on? Because there's people listening to this and say, well, that sounds great. I can't share that at work. I can't share that with my boss. I can't share that with my spouse. I can't say that out loud. How do we help people find the courage to share what they're dealing with?
Say it out loud. I think as a leader, you have to be the first. And I will say that my tagline for the show is leadership is a choice, culture is contagious. So anyone from the CEO to the janitor can be a leader in the office. And all I mean by that is it takes one person. I'm a Christian guy in a men's group, and my very first men's group, nobody shared anything for about a year and a half. And I sat there and it was like, hey, Davin, how many times did you pray today? Oh, is that all? Oh my, Davin, I will. But when I finally I walked in, I'd had a rough day and I just threw it out there. I said, guys, this is ridiculous. Someone in this group hasn't paid their mortgage. Someone's drowning in debt. Someone lost their job. Someone hates their wife. Let's go. Let's have a real conversation. And someone said, we're about to lose our house. I've been in this group with this guy for a year and a half, and he's about to lose his house. But it took someone pushing him just a little bit. And I'm not saying you need to come out and raise your hand and say, I'm drowning in debt, or I can't pay my mortgage, or I'm an alcoholic. I think we can all get to the really rough stuff, either in our personal groups or at work. But it starts with something as simple as me sitting in the boardroom with all the other leaders or all the other individual contributors, raising my hand and saying, Davin, I'm not going to get the project done on time. I'm behind. It's my fault. I own it. I've had some things going on at home, and it's due Friday. I recognize that. I'm not going to be able to get it to you until Monday, and here's why. Or if you're a sales leader, listen, every sales leader is going to hit their number at the beginning of the month, and at the end of the month, all of a sudden it's, well, the one deal slipped. What about at the beginning of the month saying, hey, I recognize that we don't have the funnel to justify us hitting our number this month. That is a really vulnerable thing, but it starts with that. And I'm telling you, if you're the first one, someone else is going to raise their hand. You're the sales leader saying we're not going to hit our number. All of a sudden, product raises their hand and says, we're actually not going to have the product fully developed and launched until Q3 of next year, despite the fact that we said Q2. And then someone in billing is going to say, hey, we're having all sorts of issues in billing. It really takes the first, and it doesn't have to be, for me, it's my daughter. And I think that is compelling because, again, it was self-leadership that got me to where I am today. I still have a long way to go, but it can be something simple. It doesn't have to be this big, lofty failure in your life or this big, lofty addiction or whatever it is. It can be small, but it takes someone from the janitor to the CEO to say, I'm not going to get the job done and I need help.
That's so good. Obviously your brand is called Council Culture, and there's a lot of talk about culture, and people sometimes think I've been to a lot of places where the building looks great. They've got great coffee bars, they've got great open spaces, they've got the environment's fantastic, free food, all this stuff. But none of that is as powerful as what you just said. And when we can create places where people can share, hey, I'm not going to get this done, and here's why, or I'm struggling with this. And then other people, we have, I love that I get to come into this office because we've got a very special team, and we've created a place where we could say, I'm struggling with X. We've actually gotten to a place where we don't even have to say that anymore. You could see it on people's face that they're struggling. And Adam, you met Adam before the
Yep.
podcast. And one of the things that I love that Adam has done, people joke that, I share the how can I help talk a lot in different conferences. How can I help? How can I help? How can I help? And if I'm having a bad day, which believe it or not happens, Eric, I will come in and Adam will see it on my face, and he will literally just come over to me and say, how can I help? He
Yep.
won't ask what's wrong, right? Because a lot of times we'll say, hey, what's up? Or how are you doing? Are you okay? And what do people say? I'm fine.
I'm
I'm
fine.
good. I'm fine. They're not fine. Listen, any of you who are married, if you ask your spouse how they're doing and they answer fine, that it's not fine. That's not an answer that you want to hear, right? And so how often do we ask people, how are they doing? And the answer is, I'm fine, versus creating environments where people can actually either say, I'm struggling, I'm dealing with this, I need help, or better yet, you've done it so well that others can recognize that you're not fine without you saying anything. And they could just walk up to you and say, Eric, how can I help? What's going on?
But it takes us listening. We've got to listen really well. I know that one of the areas I struggle the most in, particularly with my kids, but also here at work, is listening, because I'll hear it's fine. But what is it? 85% of communication is nonverbal. While I'm typing away on a Zoom call on another screen, pretending to be available, I'm not listening. And so often these cues, people cue us and tell us that they're not doing fine. I would argue that the majority of us were not listening. Again, myself included.
How can we be, maybe talk a little bit? I don't know if this is in your book, You Are Enough, but how can we be more aware of that? How can we be more present? That, because I share this, we've become human doings rather than human beings.
Yeah.
We're constantly doing, rather than being in the moment. And if we're present and we're being in the moment, we hear those cues or we see those cues, and we are able to step in those moments where people are crying out for help, even if they're not doing it verbally, and we can step in and we can fulfill our purpose in those moments.
I think it goes back to, actually, I had a gentleman on the show, my show, Scott O'Neill. Maybe you know Scott. Scott was the former CEO of the Philadelphia 76ers and the New Jersey Blue Devils. Hockey and football, professional hockey, I beg your pardon, professional hockey, professional basketball. He talked about coming home most nights from a basketball game with his phone in hand, looking down, watching to see the final score of his game, the final score of others' game. Are they going to make the playoffs? Meanwhile, he's looking at his phone, talking to his wife, and his wife one day put her hand up and said, I'll wait.
Ooh.
And it was, the way he describes it, both in the book and on the podcast, it's like, I like such a burn. But I have this moment after reading that book and having the conversation with him to realize that the book is called Be Where Your Feet Are. And it's just the idea of being present. And it's far more than being present. I mean, he lost a dear friend of his, and he references that in the book. But just being present in the moment. And for so many of us, we've grown accustomed to Zoom and Teams as our way of communication. I'm a big proponent of voice first communication. Pick up the phone, because I can hear the inflection of your voice or in your voice, but I can't hear the inflection in your email. I can assume the way you're writing it in an email. So the first things first, pick up the phone, voice first communication. Don't send a text, don't send an email when you can make a phone call. And I know that sounds contrary to popular belief, but Davin, if I send you an email right now, the task of me getting that answer, despite the fact that I don't have the answer, it's on your plate now. It's not my task anymore because I've emailed you. But if I pick up the phone, I get to have a phone call with you. We get to build and establish a better rapport and relationship. But also when all things are what they are, and I've got to do a Teams or a Zoom call, or I've got to send an email, be present. When I'm on a Zoom call, Don't have CNN sitting up in front of you. Don't have ESPN or Fox News. Put your phone down and be present. Shut your email and be present in the moment. And I'm telling you, just try it for a week. I'm not the greatest at it. I actually, while we were talking, pulled up Safari because I wanted to pull up and reference a CEO and I had forgotten his name. So I think there's times for it. But if you're genuinely present in the moment, you're going to hear people in a very different light, and people will be real with you. And I'm fine will turn into, you know what, Eric, it's been a tough week. And then rather than me glossing over and saying, all right, well, let's jump in, let's do the podcast, it's, well, wait a minute, Davin, talk to me. Why has it been a tough week? Oh man, I had one of those weeks 2 weeks ago. Let me tell you about the 2 weeks I had and the run that I had and how I overcame it. I called in sick one day or whatever it is that you did. Now we've got a better relationship with one another and we're present in each other's lives in a far more meaningful way.
So, so good. Oh my gosh. I just appreciate your vulnerability, your honesty. I hope that those who are listening to this will actually take that and apply it to themselves, to their teams, to their workplaces. As we are wrapping up here in our final moments together, two questions for you. One, talk to me one more time about the book, You Are Enough, the title, the inspiration behind it, when we can expect it to be out, and what I would get from it as a reader.
The book will be out the first quarter of 2023. We're close. I'm very excited. And the title actually came from my wife. Here's another vulnerable moment. The 27th of October is the second anniversary of my sister-in-law's passing. She died of, and I'll call it 11-year battle with alcohol. And as we were driving home from the funeral, and when I say driving home, we had a 26-hour drive from Phoenix back to Minnesota where I live. My wife looked at me as we left Starbucks and she just said, man, I wish Maddie knew. And I said, knew what? She said, I just wish Maddie knew that she was enough.
Mm.
And it was that like eye-opening moment. And maybe it was the first moment where I realized again that I was enough. Because, and here's a really important thing. We all look back. Maybe you've got an estranged relationship. Maybe you've got, whatever it is. I had to look past all the mistakes that I've made, as in my case, as a parent. They're the same mistakes that everybody did, right? We sent our kid to bed without dinner because they were fussing, or they couldn't have dessert, or they didn't get a soda, or maybe we had a bad day at work and we raised our voice at them. I had to look past all of that and recognize that in the moment, I'm 42, so I was 20 when she was born. As a 20-year-old dad, in the moment at 20 or 21 or 25, I did the best that I could with the tools that I had, and I am enough. So, practically speaking, what are you going to get from the book? I'm going to share more of my journey. I'm going to share some of my childhood and some of those like instrumental moments where I felt definitively that I was not enough. Again, my parents divorced. My first marriage ended in divorce. My relationship with my daughter. But we're going to give real practical tools to come to terms with the fact that you, the reader, you are enough. And if your kids are suffering the way mine have, that they are enough. And that you, as a business leader, for firing that person 3 years ago the wrong way, or hiring that person that you ultimately had to fire, and looking back, you were the best version of yourself that you could be in that moment. Now, that best version of yourself might not be the best version, but like Davin, you had a rough 8 days and you came in and you gave it the best that you could with the tools that you had that day. Also, we're going to challenge you to set everything aside and be the best version of yourself each and every day going forward.
So, so good. I cannot wait to read that book. Can't wait for it to come out. It's a message that I think everyone will resonate with, that we all can hear and need to hear. It's a big challenge. It's a big struggle today. And so, Eric, thank you for pouring so much of yourself into that work, sharing so much of yourself with us, the listeners today. And, as we do come to a close here, if you could leave those listening today with one final thought, one last thought, what would it be?
Wow, that's a tough question. Again, I think that underlying message of you are enough is something that we all struggle with. And I would Next time you open social media, and many of you are listening to this on a smartphone, as you're scrolling social media later today, with all of your problems in the forefront of your mind, as you see someone's amazing vacation or the incredible steak that they're eating over a fancy dinner, recognize that every single person that you scroll past, that you internally, just for a moment's time, have a little envy of their excursion, recognize that their big vacation comes with a lot of debt, and their amazing house comes with months they struggle to pay the mortgage, and recognize that everyone is struggling the same way that we are, and that you too are enough.
So good. So good. Thank you, Eric. I'm so grateful for you, for our conversations together, for you sharing everything that you did today. Cannot wait for your upcoming book. For those who are listening today, where can they reach you, follow you, check out more of your story? What's the best way to connect?
Couple places. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very vocal on LinkedIn. I share a lot. Some people say I share too much, but I think sharing is great. So you can find me on LinkedIn. Counsel Culture, COUNSEL, is also has its own page on LinkedIn, or just find me on my website, ericbrooker.com.
Excellent. Excellent. So, so good. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation together. For those of you listening today, again, here with Eric Brooker, the founder and CEO of Counsel Culture, host of the Counsel Culture podcast, and author of the upcoming book, You Are Enough. You are going to want to get your hands on that book. So relevant, so needed. Eric, thank you so much again for sharing so much of yourself and your work with our listeners today.
Davin, thanks for having me.
It truly is our pleasure. And for those of you listening, please, I implore you, go check out Eric's work, get Eric's book, and a reminder, you are enough. We'll see you next time on the What Good Looks Like podcast.